Hey guys, it's Grant here coming at you from the tone booth. I basically wanted to take a chance today and teach you guys something that I have found invaluable. Something that has saved me hundreds, thousands, and even made me money with the beginning of Goodwood Audio. That is how to solder a patch cable. Inevitably for me, this led to soldering a whole bunch of other things from circuit boards, cables, specialty items, modding pedals, all sorts of things. It opened up a lot of doors for me, and I want to teach you guys the basic principles of how to solder today in this video. Instead of just showing you guys how to solder a patch cable, I want to teach you guys what to look out for in a good solder connection and how to create a good solder connection for whatever it is you find yourself soldering in the future. It's one of those teach a man or a woman how to fish rather than give them a meal type thing. I want to put the tools in your guys' hands to be able to do this stuff yourself. First, why don't we start out with some of the basic tools that I use on a day-to-day soldering expedition so you guys can kind of figure out what might work best for you. I've put all of this in the past in a blog. I've listed links to the tools, where to buy them, all that type of stuff. There are no affiliate links, so I'm not making any money from this video. I just want to teach you guys what I've found so valuable in the past. So if we look at the camera here, some of the tools that I find extremely useful, let's try and go from most useful to least, or the ones I use the most. Obviously the first one is a soldering iron. So the soldering iron, this one is an FX 100 by Hako. I'm not sure how we're gonna say this one today. Love this iron though. I've done Weller, no name brands, but this is the one that I've ended up kind of sticking with. Weller, I have to say, is unbelievable as well, but this one does the trick for me. Probably not gonna be the iron you get if you're gonna be just starting out. It's kind of, for me, something I use across PCBs, cables, all sorts of things, and it's a little bit more pricey, but so long as you get something with enough wattage on it, you'll be fine. If you're doing basic cables, most soldering irons will do. So again, look into the blog that I wrote. I'll go into a whole bunch more detail there. But a good soldering iron, you'll be glad you made the investment. After that, one of the things I use a ton, side cutters or flush cutters, whatever you want to call them. These are very handy, especially when you're making patch cables and later on into junction boxes as well. This I haven't really used until very recently. I'm still a bit undecided, wire stripper. I'm much more comfortable with a Stanley knife, X-Acto knife, box cutter. I love these. Getting used to these. See which one you like. I'll show you how to use this in the video because this is pretty self-explanatory. A jig. This thing has been with me for quite a while. There's something loose in there. This just holds the plugs and it holds it in place so I can solder. It's kind of like a third hand. I make cables slightly differently than I know a lot of other people do. I go for speed because I have to make a whole bunch of them, and quality. And this is one of the ways that I do that. I'll show you later in the video. If you're making a lot of cables, especially with pancakes or screws in them to kind of fasten the cap, a little mini screwdriver is very handy. They're pretty cheap, 20, 30 bucks, you'll be able to get one. And it just speeds you up a little bit, so can be handy. A normal screwdriver works. My favorite tool, oh man, especially for junction boxes, if you're using a lot of hookup wire, on cables, this will take off the outside jacket. After that, I don't use it for a cable, but it just pulls that jacket off. Again, I'll show you how to use that. Some pliers, very good for closing or opening strain relief on a cable. So these are great for right angle plugs, straight plugs often have strain relief. A few other plug types have these. Pancakes do not require these. Very handy. Especially, I have to point out, these ones are covered in glue from Velcro and all sorts of things. I use these all the time. The teeth on here, you have to have teeth for strain relief or else it can kind of slip off, get a bit annoying. just some needle nose pliers. These I do not use for strain relief. These ones do not have teeth on them, so they aren't really helpful for that. These just help to get into different areas and kind of a all-around useful tool. Again, don't really use them that much for cables. Needle nose, these are SMT pliers, mainly for making circuit boards. But when you're making cables, every once in a while, if you need to get into something, get rid of a little strand that maybe you missed, these can get into tight places and help you out. This is a bit more of a controversial one. This is my flux bottle. We've been through a lot together. This flux is the same thing that you will find in the center of, don't look for it because you won't see it, but it's there. It's like in the middle of flux core solder. So this stuff is basically the cause of what you see, the smoke or evaporation, what you see when you actually melt solder. It's not the metal, the tin, the lead that is causing that smoke. It's actually the flux. So inside of solder, you have this stuff. This is basically just a little bit extra. So I put 1 drop, not anymore, sometimes half a drop on connections, and it basically allows me to work quicker, more efficiently, and I can really see the solder connections improve because of using this. I don't see a whole lot of other cable makers using this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I find it extremely helpful. I'll show you again in the video today. Then I have a solder sucker. This thing basically is what you use when you make a mistake. So if you need to get rid of old solder on a connection, you basically pump that down, melt the solder, and then it'll take it all away, just like that. So this thing is very handy if you are into making mistakes and redoing your work properly. I have made all the mistakes in the book, so this, again, very handy. Lastly, I don't think I've missed anything here. I just have some 2319 cable by Mogami and a couple of plugs. So I'm gonna do a standard patch cable today, one with a pancake and one with a right angle. So that is it for the tools. In just a second, I'll get everything set up here and I'm gonna show you how to make a patch cable. But more importantly, I'm gonna show you what to look out for in a strong, great, reliable solder connection. Hopefully this is gonna be something that's helpful, something you'll be able to use. Let's get into actually making this cable. One thing I forgot, which is not gonna be in this video, because this is not my normal workbench, is fume extraction. Very important. Recently I put out a reel asking if you are a sniffer, a dodger, or if you use fume extraction. Please take care of your lungs when you're doing this type of thing, when you're soldering. The fumes aren't great as far as all the chemicals that are in them, so it's best just to get rid of them. I use actually a duct fan that you'd find in any house, the same thing that takes the humidity out of your bathroom when you're taking a shower, the fan on the roof. It's a duct fan. It's a very cheap way to get great fume extraction, and I just put it out of a window, and that's basically it. So I just turn it on. The downside is they are a little bit noisy, but I'd rather have a little bit of background noise and save my lungs than not. So let's get into making that cable, and I'll walk you through this step by step. All right, so you aren't gonna be able to see me for this video, but you can see my hands, and I'm gonna walk you through what I do when I wanna make a patch cable. The first thing you need to do is prep your cable. Again, I'm gonna use a knife for this, and I'm just gonna score the cable. If you're unfamiliar with how far to score something, just line it up. Pick a spot in front of the strain relief. Not too far in front or else it'll be harder to work with. This is why we get these guys. Oh, look at that. That was just beautiful. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna peel the ground. And again, if you want your cable to point in a certain direction, this is where you can choose where the ground is gonna go. And wherever the ground goes, that's gonna be deciding on what direction your plug points. For a straight plug, obviously, this isn't really a big deal. For a right angle, like these two, it is. So I'm peeling away the conductive shielding here. if this conductive shielding that I just peeled away touches the tip connection, it will short the cable and basically sound like you have a blanket over your tone. I'm gonna use a knife for this first side of the cable, and I'm just gonna score it gently, get my fingernail in there, twist and pull. That is my preferred way, if I'm gonna be totally honest, mainly because it's what I'm most comfortable with. Now I'm gonna do this right angle first. I'm gonna trim the ground back so we have no chance of shorting to the tip. This is the sleeve ground, and then this is the tip or the hot connection, depending on who you're talking to. And I'm just gonna put that underneath there like that. Now the fun part, the flux. I'm gonna do 1 drop of flux now that I have the tip connection here. That's playing hard to get. There we go, 1 drop there, 1 drop on the ground. And I completely forgot solder. Guys, I'll be right back. All right. We got some solder. Just heating up my iron now that I've taken it off the stand. And you don't need much. I usually just like to make sure that hole is filled. For the right angle connection, I'm gonna give away one of my secrets here. I melt solder on the plug first, mainly for right angles here, straights. Then I drop the sleeve into the melted solder. Because that flux is on there, it all just comes together really nicely. So let me show you this connection here. Let me get it in focus. So you can see that nice smooth connection, a little bit of shine. If you look at the ground there, there's no loose wires. There's no way that connection is going to come off. So that is the right angle. The most painful thing you can do right now is forget to put the shell on. We have all been there before. If you have ever made a cable, you have forgotten the shell at one point, I'm sure. Put the shell on. We're gonna get our needle nose pliers here, and we are going to close this. You don't have to go absolutely crazy by crushing the cable here. You just want to get a little bit of a squeeze so that if something terrible happens and this cable gets absolutely trashed or pulled on, you got a little bit of strain relief there as well. And now we can put that on. If you were doing another right angle on the other side or a short body straight, this would be the point where you put the other shell on this side in reverse in preparation for the next plug. We are doing a pancake though, so we don't need to do that. Oh, that's good. And now, just to see if we can get these pointing in the same direction, so we have the right angle on this side that's done, and the ground for the pancake, as you can see, is right in the middle here. So we want the ground to kind of point in such a way that will allow these plugs to point the same direction, or flip it opposite if you want them pointing in the opposite direction. Pull that ground down a bit, twist it together. Take off the conductive shield so we have a cable that works. It's personally my preference when they work first try. Oh yeah, we weren't gonna use this. We're gonna use this. I believe this is a 24 gauge center. So I'll just do that a couple times and we should be able to pull that off. I'm just quicker with a knife, so I prefer the knife, but I'm sure I would prefer the wire stripper if that's what I was used to as well. And we will just trim our ground. It's always best when soldering as well for the copper. So we have copper in the center conductor and on the sleeve. Ideally, that is touching the metal that you want it to adhere to. You don't want solder to be the only thing connecting the two joints. So now a little bit more technique on the solder. I showed you what to look for before. Let's talk technique. What I'm gonna do, I'll walk you through this. While I'm soldering, once the solder is on this iron, I basically wanna bring it in and I wanna be heating up the copper of the cable and then the tin or whatever the material is you're soldering to. I wanna touch those with this iron tip at the same time. I want both of those connections to heat up together, get ideally to the same temperature, and that'll allow the solder to flow between the two evenly and make a really strong connection. If I were to just touch the copper of the cable and not touch the plug solder connection, we are not gonna get as good of a connection there. We might get a cold solder joint, which is basically, it looks dull. You can probably get your fingernail underneath and you can potentially just pull it right up. You want a smooth connection, nothing that can get caught or pulled, which basically tells you a little bit of the health of that connection. You want a little bit of a sheen to it as well. Sheen is a good word for soldering. So let's give this a try. I'm gonna put just a drop of solder on here. Solder, sorry, I've been corrected on that. Touch both. And look at that. I don't think I can bring it up too much without it going out of focus, but you can see a nice little sheen there. You can hear whatever's inside this jig rattling around. That's a good connection. Now we're gonna do something similar with the ground. That'll be a little bit harder to see on camera. Try and swing it around here. And we're gonna try and touch both again, both the sleeve of the cable and the tab on the plug. Oh yeah, that looks great. And honestly, you should be able to rip on this pretty hard. I wouldn't recommend it, but those connections should not pull away. A good connection will be able to withstand a lot of abuse, even though we don't want to test that theory. These solder connections should really stand the test of time. All right, now we're gonna get the plug shell on here. I'm gonna use my screwdriver, awkwardly holding this thing in place. I just do it halfway. You might be wondering why this piece of wood is on my jig. You're about to find out. This basically butts the plug up against the wood so it doesn't twist when I get to the end of the screw's thread. Allows me to get a little bit tighter so they won't come out later. There we go. They're both, I'm not holding them in place, they're both pointing in relatively the same direction here. There we are. There's your cable. Next, I'm gonna show you how to test this thing. Okay, so we now have a finished cable, but we have no idea if it works or not. I'm feeling pretty confident, but that's not good enough. We need to test it. So what's the best way to test a cable? Who knows? Let's find out today. I'll give you two options, three actually. If you don't want to buy a tester, just run it in line with a true bypass looper. You can put it on the send and return of a true bypass looper. You can plug in two pedals, one into the other, into an amp. That's kind of the easiest, cheapest way to test, but not the best, because it doesn't tell you if there are partial connections or that conductive insulator I was telling you to get rid of on the cable. That one will still test good, but it will sound quite dull, and you basically just don't want that. So let's be sure about it, and let's get a cable tester. That is right here. This is option one. Not necessarily great for short cables depending on the format of your cable tester. If you have 1/4" jacks on top, you can test just about anything you like. If you have them on the side like I do, you probably can't because a short cable won't reach both connections. The one that I love using, if I had to choose one for everything, every scenario, is a multimeter. And so you can see on camera, this multimeter, super handy. What you basically do is switch it over to the continuity setting. And you'd set it to beep when there is a short. Basically what that means, we touch the two probes together or two connections on a cable. If they are connected, you will hear a beep. Sometimes that beep is good, Other times that beep is bad. Let's use this to demonstrate that on the cable. So a good beep, obviously, we want the two sleeves or grounds to be connected. We want to hear a beep when we touch those. Perfect. When I touch ground to tip or sleeve to tip, I do not want to hear a beep. Great. And then I slide up, and then we do the tips of both ends. Those are connected. That's perfect. You can also use a multimeter and set it to the resistance setting and measure the ohms for that cable. So you'll get a really good idea pretty quick. If you have a super high value on resistance, you will probably want to check that cable. You can also test it via audio that way as well. Plug it into those cables, see if it sounds just as good as your other known good cables. There's a few approaches to this. I would say if budget allows, get both a cable tester if you are making a ton of cables. This is a quick and easy way to do it, but a multimeter ultimately is going to be your best friend across a whole bunch of different scenarios in future. So that is how to test the cable. Luckily, I didn't test this ahead of time, so I'm glad that on camera that tested well the first time. After making thousands of cables, you're gonna be pretty certain from the get-go if your cable is gonna work, but still test it anyways, make sure, and you won't be disappointed halfway through your build when something isn't working the way you intended. So just to review from today, we have made a patch cable, but more importantly, hopefully I've given you some things to look out for in a good solder connection. You can tell from how I did it. Basically, I wanted to heat up both sides of the connection. In our case today, the plug solder tab and then the piece of cable that was going to be attached to that. We want to heat those up to the same temperature, apply solder. In my case, I like adding just a drop of flux as well. And then from there, we can hold it down for between 2 and 3 seconds, and you should see a great connection form. If something is oxidized or the solder is not attaching quite right, you can use some isopropyl alcohol to clean off the connection and then try again. For tricky connections, sometimes if there is going to be especially a ground connection that just seems to be taking ages to heat up, you can pre-tin or just add a drop of solder just to that ground connection in the way that I showed you. Heat up that tab, add a little bit of solder, and then bring in the tiniest bit of extra solder just to heat up that connection again, and then introduce the cable from there. Little tips and tricks you're gonna learn along the way. Take good care of your iron tips as you go. Look after your products. Keep them in plastic bags if you aren't going to use them for a while to prevent any oxidization from the environment. You should be pretty good to go for years to come. That is how to solder the Goodwood Audio way. Post your questions below. I know I have not covered everything. There's a ton of different cable types and approaches you can take, but hopefully this is enough to get you started. Happy to help with questions as we move forward. That's it for today. We'll see you for another video next week on the Goodwood Audio YouTube channel.